The rain was hammering against the large glass windows of the Velvet Note, a steady, rhythmic drumming that matched the pounding headache Maya had been fighting all afternoon. It was a Tuesday, usually a quiet night for the upscale jazz lounge, but the air inside felt heavy, charged with a kind of nervous energy that put everyone on edge. Maya adjusted the strap of her apron, trying to find a comfortable spot, but it was impossible. She had been on her feet for 6 hours already, running back and forth between the kitchen and the dining floor, her feet throbbing in her worn-out waitressing shoes. She walked over to an empty table near the corner to wipe down a spot that was already clean. It gave her a moment to pause, to catch her breath, and to look across the dimly lit room. There, in the center of the floor, sat the object that fascinated her more than anything else in the restaurant, a sleek, black grand piano. It was beautiful. The wood gleamed under the spotlight, looking almost liquid in the low light. It stood on a small raised platform, commanding attention even when no one was playing it. Maya sighed, a sound that was lost in the clatter of dishes from the kitchen. She loved that piano. Every night she worked, she found herself stealing glances at it, remembering what it felt like to let her fingers dance over the keys. But that felt like a lifetime ago. Before the bills piled up. Before her grandmother got sick. Before the world became less about music and more about survival. Now, her hands were busy carrying heavy trays and scrubbing tables, not playing concertos. In the back office, she could hear the manager, Tom, shouting into the phone. Tom was usually a calm guy, the kind who joked with the staff and made sure everyone got their breaks, but tonight he looked like he was about to explode. He slammed the office door shut, but his muffled yelling still filtered out into the restaurant. The bartender, a guy named Leo who was busy polishing glasses, leaned over the counter and whispered to Maya. "Julian isn't coming," Leo said, keeping his voice low. Maya's heart skipped a beat. Julian was the regular pianist. He was the one who filled the silence with soft jazz and classical melodies that made the expensive food taste better and the high-priced drinks feel worth it. "Is he sick?" "Flu," Leo nodded. "Bad case. Tom is trying to find a replacement, but nobody is answering on a rainy Tuesday night." Maya looked back at the empty piano bench. It looked lonely without Julian there. The restaurant relied on that music. It wasn't just background noise, it was the heartbeat of the place. Without it, the restaurant was just a room with tables and chairs. The mood instantly felt flat. The customers sitting at the tables were looking around, noticing the silence. The low hum of conversation felt louder and more awkward without the smooth sound of piano keys to soften it. Tom came out of the office a few minutes later, looking pale and sweating. He ran a hand through his hair, messing it up completely. He walked straight to the center of the room, looking around as if he expected a musician to magically appear out of thin air. When he saw Maya standing by the wall, he gave her a weak, frustrated shrug. "This is a disaster," he muttered to himself, loud enough for her to hear. "He's going to kill me." "Who?" Maya asked, although she had a feeling she knew the answer. "Mr. Sterling," Tom said, checking his watch for the 10th time in 5 minutes. "He reserved the center table 3 weeks ago. He's bringing clients. He's a huge deal, Maya. He owns half the buildings in the city. If he doesn't get his perfect atmosphere, he's going to tear this place apart." Maya knew the name. Everyone in the service industry knew about Mr. Sterling. He was a millionaire, a man who built an empire on steel and concrete, but he was known for being difficult. Rumor was, he didn't just pay for food, he paid for perfection. If a glass had a spot, he sent it back. If the room was too cold, he complained. And if the music wasn't exactly right, he reduced the tip to 0. Just as the words left Tom's mouth, the heavy wooden doors at the front of the restaurant swung open. A gust of wet, cold wind blew in, carrying the smell of rain and exhaust fumes from the street. A tall man in a sharp gray suit walked in, flanked by 2 younger men in suits who looked terrified of him. It was Mr. Sterling. The entire room seemed to stiffen. Tom straightened his tie and rushed forward to greet them, putting on his best fake smile. Maya stayed in the shadows by the wall, watching. Mr. Sterling didn't smile back. He shook Tom's hand briefly, his eyes scanning the room as if he were inspecting a property he was thinking about buying. He looked cold. Impatient. He walked to his table, the best one in the house, right in front of the empty piano stage. He sat down, and his associates sat on either side of him. Tom signaled to Maya and the other waiters that they needed to be on their best game. Maya took a deep breath, picked up her notepad, and headed toward the table. She could feel her hands shaking slightly, but she forced herself to be steady. She needed this job. She needed the tips. She approached the table with a bottle of sparkling water. "Good evening, gentlemen," she said, her voice polite and professional. "Welcome to the Velvet Note." She poured the water, moving carefully. Mr. Sterling didn't look at her. He was looking past her, staring at the empty stage where the piano sat silent. The silence in the room was getting heavier by the second. Usually, by this time of night, Julian would be halfway through a soothing melody. Tonight, the only sound was the rain outside and the clinking of ice in glasses. It felt hollow. "Where is the music?" Mr. Sterling spoke suddenly. His voice wasn't loud, but it was sharp. It cut through the room like a knife. Maya froze for a split second, the water bottle hovering over the glass. She looked at Tom, who was hovering nearby, looking terrified. I am so sorry, Mr. Sterling," Tom stammered, stepping in quickly. "Our pianist came down with a sudden illness just an hour ago. We are trying to—" "I didn't ask for excuses," Sterling snapped, finally turning his cold eyes toward the manager. "I pay for a dining experience. I bring important clients here to talk business. I do not want to shout over the sound of silence. It creates a bad impression." He waved his hand dismissively, signaling Tom to leave. The tension in the room was suffocating. The other waiters were pretending to be busy, avoiding eye contact. The customers at the nearby tables were whispering, feeling uncomfortable for the staff. Maya retreated to the sideboard, her heart pounding in her chest. She watched Mr. Sterling. He looked at his watch, sighed deeply, and leaned back in his chair. He looked like a man who was ready to walk out, and if he walked out, Tom would likely lose a huge account, and the staff would probably get blamed for it. The fear in the room was palpable. You could feel it in the way the staff moved faster, in the way Tom wiped sweat from his forehead. But Maya wasn't just feeling the fear. As she looked at that empty piano, she felt something else pulling at her. It was an itch in her fingers. A deep, vibrating hum in her chest. She remembered the promise she made to herself when she took this job, that she would focus on the money and forget the music. But looking at the beautiful instrument and seeing the misery on everyone's faces, she felt that resolve crumbling. The silence stretched on. It was agonizing. Mr. Sterling started muttering something to one of his associates, shaking his head in disappointment. The magic of the restaurant was gone. It was just a business deal gone wrong. Maya stood there in the shadows, her tray held tight against her chest. She looked at the piano bench. It was empty. It was waiting. For a second, the noise of the restaurant, the complaints, the clatter, the fear seemed to fade away. All she could hear was the melody she knew could fix this. She knew she shouldn't. She knew it was risky. But the music was inside her, screaming to get out, and the silence was just too loud to ignore. 10 minutes crawled by, but inside the restaurant, it felt like hours. The silence that had settled over the Velvet Note was no longer just quiet, it had turned into a heavy, suffocating blanket. It was the kind of awkwardness that makes your skin prickle and your palms sweat. Without the smooth jazz to cover the noise, every small sound in the room seemed amplified. The scraping of a knife against a plate sounded like a shriek. The low hum of the refrigerator from the back kitchen buzzed like an angry insect. Even the ice melting in the glasses seemed to make a noise. Maya stood by the service station, folding napkins with precise, robotic movements. She was watching the room out of the corner of her eye. She could see the tension spreading. At a table near the window, a couple was trying to have a romantic date, but they kept looking around nervously, their conversation dying out every time a loud laugh erupted from the bar. The mood was ruined. The restaurant usually felt like a warm, exclusive escape from the world, but tonight it felt like a dentist's waiting room. But the biggest problem was still Mr. Sterling. He sat at his table in the center, looking like a king who was furious with his court. He hadn't touched his appetizer. He was swirling a glass of expensive red wine, staring into the deep red liquid as if he was trying to find answers in it. The two younger men with him were shifting uncomfortably in their chairs. They were trying to talk about business, pointing at papers they had spread on the table, but Sterling kept holding up a hand to silence them. He didn't want to talk, he wanted to listen to music that wasn't there. Tom, the manager, was pacing back and forth behind the bar. He looked like a caged animal. He picked up the phone, dialed a number, waited, and then slammed it down in frustration. He tried another number. Same result. He looked at his watch, then looked at Sterling, then looked at the empty piano stage. He looked helpless. Leo, the bartender, leaned over to Maya again. Tom is going to have a heart attack, he whispered. Sterling just signaled for the check. He's leaving. Maya felt a knot tighten in her stomach. If Sterling left now, unhappy, he would destroy the restaurant's reputation. He was a man who loved power, and a bad review from him could cut their business in half. She liked Tom. He was a good boss who had let her switch shifts last month when she had a family emergency. She couldn't just stand there and watch him fail because of a missing piano player. Her eyes drifted back to the grand piano. It sat there, silent and imposing. It was a shame, really. Such a beautiful instrument, built to sing, sitting mute in a room full of people who needed to hear it. Maya took a deep breath. She tried to push the thought away, but it kept coming back, stronger each time. You could play, a little voice whispered in her head. You know you can. She looked down at her hands. They were rough and red from the hot water in the kitchen. Her nails were short and practical, not manicured like the ladies sitting at Sterling's table. She looked at her uniform, a simple black dress with a white apron that smelled faintly of fried food and dish soap. She was a waitress. A server. That was her role. She wasn't a performer anymore. But the silence was getting louder. It was screaming at her. Suddenly, Sterling stood up. The movement was sharp and aggressive. The noise in the room stopped instantly. Everyone looked at him. He threw his napkin onto the table, not folding it, just letting it land crumpled on top of his untouched food. "This is unacceptable," Sterling's voice boomed across the room. He didn't shout, but he didn't have to. His voice carried that natural authority of someone used to being obeyed. "I came here for an experience, not to sit in a library." Tom rushed over from the bar, his face pale. "Mr. Sterling, please, I am so sorry. We are having a technical issue with the booking system, and—" "I don't care about your systems," Sterling cut him off, adjusting his suit jacket. "I care about value. And there is no value here. Just wasted time." He turned to his associates. "Let's go. We'll finish the meeting at the club." The two men scrambled to gather their papers. The air in the room left with them. It was over. The disaster was complete. Tom stood there, shoulders slumped, looking like he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. The other waitresses stopped moving, frozen in place, sharing looks of pity and fear. Maya watched Sterling turn toward the door. He was only a few steps away from leaving. She looked at the piano. Then she looked at Tom. She saw the defeat in his eyes. She saw the stress lines on his forehead. Something inside Maya snapped. It wasn't a logical decision. It wasn't something she planned out. It was just a spark of instinct, a sudden refusal to let the night end in failure. Before she could talk herself out of it, before her brain could list all the reasons why this was a terrible idea, Maya moved. She didn't walk towards Sterling to beg him to stay. She didn't run to the kitchen to hide. She walked toward the piano. Her feet felt heavy, like they were made of lead, but she kept moving. She passed by Sterling, who was heading for the exit. He didn't even look at her. She was just the furniture to him, a waitress in the way. She walked past Tom, who was staring at the floor. She walked past the tables of confused customers. She reached the small platform where the piano sat. The black wood looked shiny and intimidating. Up close, she could smell the polish and the faint scent of old wood. It was a smell that brought back 1,000 memories. Late nights practicing in a dusty apartment. The sound of her mother humming along. The feeling of the cold keys under her fingers on a winter morning. Maya put her hand on the smooth wooden lid. It was cool to the touch. Her heart was hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it might break through her chest. "What are you doing?" her mind screamed. "You're going to get fired. You're going to embarrass yourself." But her hand didn't listen. She pulled out the adjustable bench. It made a metallic squeak as she extended it, a sound that seemed deafening in the quiet room. A few people turned their heads. They were confused. Was she cleaning it? Was she moving it? Maya sat down on the bench. It was firm and comfortable. She took a moment to adjust her apron, smoothing it over her lap, a nervous habit she couldn't shake. She looked at the keys. 88 black and white rectangles staring back at her. She was terrified. It had been 2 years since she had played seriously. Her hands were stiff now, used to holding trays and scrubbing counters, not stretching across octaves. What if she messed up? What if her fingers were too rusty? She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the air of the restaurant, the smell of steak, wine, and anxiety. She closed her eyes for just a second to block out the room, to block out the stairs, to find that quiet place inside herself where the music lived. Behind her, the heavy door opened. Mr. Sterling was stepping out into the rain. Maya didn't look back. She lifted her hands. Her fingers hovered over the keys, trembling slightly. She hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then, she let her muscle memory take over. She didn't start with something simple and safe. She didn't play a polite background tune. She struck a chord. A deep, resonant C minor chord that filled the entire room like a thunderclap. The sound was huge. It vibrated through the floor, through the bench, and into her bones. The door, which was just halfway open, stopped moving. Sterling froze, 1 foot out the door, his back to the room. The conversation died instantly. The clinking of silverware stopped. Every head in the restaurant whipped around to look at the stage. Maya didn't stop. She let the chord hang in the air, ringing out, full of sadness and power. Then, her right hand began to move. A cascade of notes flowed down the keyboard, fast and fluid, like water rushing down a stream. It was the opening of a piece she knew by heart, a piece that was complex and demanding. She wasn't just playing notes, she was pouring all her frustration into the keys. She was playing the tiredness of her double shifts, the worry about her bills, and the sadness of her grandmother's empty house. The sound was raw and emotional. It wasn't polished or perfect like a recording, it was real. It was alive. For the first time all night, the silence wasn't awkward. It was a listening silence. A stunned silence. The air in the room seemed to change instantly. The tension shifted from uncomfortable to electric. Maya felt a wave of adrenaline wash over her. The fear was still there, but it was pushed aside by the sheer joy of playing. Her fingers, which she thought were too stiff, suddenly remembered exactly what to do. They flew across the keys, finding the notes with a precision that shocked even her. She was no longer a waitress in a stained uniform. She was a musician, and this was her voice. The sound that exploded from the piano didn't just fill the room, it seemed to shake the dust from the ceiling lights. It was a sound so full, so rich, and deep, that it felt like a physical weight pressing against everyone's chest. For the first few seconds, nobody moved. The waiters froze with trays half raised. The bartender stopped polishing a glass. Even the couple in the corner, who had been bickering about the bill, went completely still. The music wasn't gentle background noise. It was aggressive, fast, and heavy with emotion. It was a classical piece, complicated and difficult, the kind that usually requires years of daily practice to master. But the woman playing it was wearing a cheap waitress uniform with a stain on the sleeve, and her eyes were squeezed shut as if she were in pain. Maya had let go of the world. As her fingers flew across the ivory keys, she forgot she was in a restaurant. She forgot about the heavy tray in the corner, the ache in her lower back, and the stack of bills waiting for her at home. She wasn't Maya the overworked waitress anymore. In her mind, she was back in her grandmother's tiny living room, sitting at the old, upright piano that smelled like mothballs. She was playing to forget the hunger in her stomach and the coldness of the winter outside. She poured all the loneliness she had felt for the last 2 years into the music. She played her anger at the unfairness of life, her fear of the future, and her deep, aching tiredness. Because she was playing with such raw honesty, the music sounded different than anything the patrons of the Velvet Note had ever heard. The polished musicians who usually played there were talented, yes, but they played for a paycheck. They played songs that were safe and smooth. Maya was playing for her life. Every note was desperate and beautiful. Mr. Sterling had 1 foot out the heavy oak door when the first chord hit him. The cold night air was swirling around his legs, but the sound cut through the wind like a hot knife. He froze. His hand gripped the door handle, his knuckles turning white. He didn't turn around immediately. He just stood there, listening. The melody was dark and stormy, moving fast like a running river. It was technically difficult, requiring the left hand to jump rapidly while the right hand played a cascade of fast, light notes. Sterling knew music. He had season's tickets to the symphony and a pristine sound system in his penthouse. He knew that what he was hearing was not just good for an amateur. It was exceptional. It was the kind of playing that couldn't be taught, it was a gift. Slowly, he pulled his foot back inside. He let the door swing shut, cutting off the rainy night. He turned around, his face no longer a mask of anger. Instead, he looked confused. He looked at the stage, squinting through the dim light to make sure his eyes weren't playing tricks on him. He saw the waitress. The same girl who had poured his water 10 minutes ago without looking him in the eye. She was hunched over the keys, her body swaying back and forth with the rhythm. Her posture was terrible, her elbows were too high, her neck was bent, but the sound was pure magic. Inside the room, the atmosphere was shifting. The uncomfortable silence that had plagued the restaurant earlier was gone, replaced by a heavy, awe-filled stillness. This was a different kind of quiet. It was the kind of quiet you find in a church or a library, where people are afraid to speak because they might ruin something precious. The other diners stopped eating. Plates of expensive pasta and half-eaten steaks sat forgotten on the tables. People turned their chairs toward the piano. It didn't matter that the woman playing was part of the service staff. In that moment, the barrier between the haves and the have-nots dissolved. There was no millionaire, no waiter, no manager. There was just the music. Maya's playing became more intense. The music shifted from the dark, stormy beginning into a middle section that was softer but incredibly sad. The tempo slowed down. Her fingers caressed the keys, drawing out a melody that was so gentle it made some of the listeners blink back tears. It was a sound of longing, of dreams that had been put on a shelf. Tom, the manager, stood behind the bar with his mouth open. He had hired Maya because she was reliable and showed up on time. He had no idea she possessed this kind of talent. He watched her hands, which were usually chapped and red from washing dishes, moving with the grace of a surgeon or a magician. He felt a lump form in his throat. He realized that for years, he had been working alongside a genius and never known it. The song was building toward a climax. The notes started to climb higher and higher, growing louder and more urgent. Maya's foot pressed down on the sustain pedal, and the sound swelled until it seemed to bounce off the walls. She was playing faster now, a blur of motion. The effort was physical, a bead of sweat rolled down her temple and dripped onto her collar, but she didn't wipe it away. She was fully inside the song. Mr. Sterling walked back to his table, but he didn't sit down. He stood in the aisle, his arms crossed, staring at the stage. The two associates who were with him looked at each other, shrugged, and also stood up to watch. They were supposed to be discussing a multi-million-dollar contract, but suddenly, that seemed very boring compared to what was happening on the stage. There was something captivating about the contrast. The restaurant was fancy, polished, and expensive. The piano was a masterpiece of craftsmanship. The people were dressed in silk and wool. But the soul of the room right now was coming from a tired woman in a stained apron who played like she had nothing left to lose. As the music rushed toward its peak, the tension in the room became almost unbearable. It felt like watching a tightrope walker in a windstorm. Maya hit a series of high, trilling notes that sparkled like crystal, and then her left hand crashed down on the low keys to support her. The vibration was so strong that the glasses on the tables buzzed slightly. She wasn't thinking about technique, she wasn't thinking about the audience. She was remembering the feeling of her mother's hand on her shoulder when she was a little girl, telling her that music was the only thing in the world that never lied. She was playing for the mother she lost and the grandmother she couldn't afford to keep in a good home. The music was a conversation she was having with her past, loud and clear. The patrons were mesmerized. A young woman near the front put her hand over her heart, her eyes wide. An older man in a tuxedo took off his glasses to wipe them, visibly moved. The music had stripped away the fake politeness of the evening. It was raw. It was human. And it was happening right in front of them, completely unexpected. Maya felt the energy in the room change, even with her eyes closed. She could feel the silence getting heavier, but it wasn't hostile anymore. It was supportive. It was as if the entire room was holding its breath, afraid that if they breathed too loudly, the spell would break and she would stop. She didn't stop. She pushed the tempo even faster, her fingers dancing on the edge of control. It was dangerous and thrilling. She took a final, deep breath and threw herself into the last chaotic run of the song, the notes cascading down the keyboard like a waterfall, rushing toward the final, resolving chord. The sweat was pouring down her face now, ruining her makeup, but she didn't care. She was going to finish this. She was going to pour every last ounce of energy she had left into this moment. The restaurant was no longer a place of business, it was a concert hall, and she was the conductor of their emotions. The music soared, filling every corner, drowning out the rain, drowning out the world, leaving only the sound of the piano and the heartbeat of the woman playing it. The final chord seemed to hang in the air forever, vibrating through the floorboards and the soles of Maya's shoes. Then, slowly, the sound melted away, leaving a heavy, ringing silence in its wake. It wasn't the awkward, uncomfortable silence from before. This was different. It was a living, breathing quiet, the kind that happens when something truly important has just been said and everyone is too afraid to speak. Maya's hands hovered over the keys for a heartbeat, her fingers trembling slightly from the exertion. Her chest was heaving, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. For a few seconds, she kept her eyes closed, scared to open them. She was terrified that if she looked, the magic would be gone. She would just be a tired waitress in a dirty uniform, and the people staring at her would be angry. Slowly, reality began to creep back in. The air conditioning hummed. The smell of roasted garlic and expensive perfume filled her nose again. She could feel the sweat cooling on the back of her neck. Maya opened her eyes. The first thing she saw was the expanse of black and white keys under her fingers. Then, she looked up. The sight made her stomach drop. Every single person in the restaurant was standing still, facing her. It was like a scene from a movie where time stops. The waiters were frozen in the aisles. The diners had turned their chairs away from their tables. Even the kitchen staff had peeked through the service doors, their faces pressed against the stainless steel. Panic began to rise in Maya's throat, hot and sour. What had she just done? She had abandoned her job. She had touched the expensive instrument that was strictly off limits to staff. She had made a scene. Mr. Sterling was going to scream. Tom was going to fire her on the spot. She quickly pulled her hands back from the piano as if the keys had suddenly turned red hot. She stood up from the bench, her legs feeling wobbly and weak. She smoothed down her apron, a useless nervous habit, and looked around frantically for the manager. I'm so sorry, she stammered, her voice sounding small and shaky in the quiet room. I didn't mean to. I just thought. Her voice trailed off. Nobody answered. They just stared. It was the stare of people who have seen a ghost, or perhaps a miracle. It made Maya want to run. She took a small step backward, ready to flee to the safety of the kitchen, ready to grab her coat and never come back. Then, movement caught her eye. It was Mr. Sterling. He hadn't returned to his seat. He was still standing in the aisle, exactly where he had stopped when the music began. But he had changed. The angry, red-faced tyrant who had been shouting about incompetence was gone. His shoulders were slumped slightly, relaxed. He looked older, somehow, and much more human. He was holding his wine glass loosely in one hand, but he wasn't looking at the wine. He was looking straight at Maya. Slowly, deliberately, he placed the wine glass on a nearby table without taking his eyes off her. Then, he began to walk toward the stage. The room seemed to hold its breath collectively. The other patrons watched him, mesmerized. This was the man who owned half the city, a man who usually inspired fear or resentment. But now, he walked with the slow, heavy steps of a man in a trance. Maya felt her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. He was coming to yell. He was going to demand a refund. He was going to tell her she was a fraud. She clasped her hands together in front of her, squeezing her fingers tight until they turned white. "I'll get back to work," Maya whispered, her voice trembling. "Please, I'm sorry." She turned to grab her serving tray, but Mr. Sterling reached the edge of the raised platform. He stepped up, his expensive leather shoes making a soft thud on the wood. He was now standing only a few feet away from her. Up close, he looked different than he had from across the room. He looked tired. There were deep dark circles under his eyes, and lines on his face that seemed to be etched by years of stress and hard decisions. He didn't look like a monster, he looked like a man who carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. He didn't speak immediately. He looked past Maya, at the piano keys. He seemed to be remembering something, a memory playing behind his eyes. Then, his gaze shifted back to her face. He looked at her stained apron, her messy hair, and her terrified expression. "You," he said finally. His voice wasn't loud, but it was deep and rough, like gravel crunching under tires. "You have been serving me wine all night." Maya nodded, too scared to speak. She just gripped her hands tighter. "And all this time," Sterling continued, gesturing vaguely at the piano bench, "you were hiding this in there." He took another step closer. There was no anger in his voice. There was only curiosity, and a deep, profound confusion. He was a man who believed he understood value. He knew how much a building cost. He knew how much a company was worth. He prided himself on being able to look at something and assess its worth instantly. But the equation in front of him didn't make sense. He saw a woman who was struggling to survive, who was cleaning up messes for minimum wage. Yet, she had just played with a soul that he had only heard in the most prestigious concert halls in Europe. It was a contradiction his business mind couldn't solve. Maya finally found her voice, though it was barely a squeak. I didn't mean to cause trouble, sir." The pianist was sick, and the silence it was hurting the room. "I just wanted to help." "Help," Sterling repeated the word, as if he had never heard it before. He let out a short, dry chuckle that didn't sound like his usual arrogant laugh. It sounded more like a breath of disbelief. "You didn't just help, young lady. You humiliated every musician I've hired in the last 10 years. Maya flinched, thinking it was an insult. But then she saw the corner of his mouth twitch upward. It wasn't a smile, exactly, but it was the closest thing to a smile his face seemed capable of. The restaurant was still dead silent. The tension in the air had shifted completely. Before, it was a nervous tension, the feeling before a storm. Now, it was electric. It felt like the moment just before a sports team wins the championship. Everyone was leaning forward, waiting to see what would happen next. The waiters had stopped pretending to work. Tom was standing by the bar, his hands resting on the counter, his mouth slightly open. Sterling looked around the room for a moment, acknowledging the audience. Then, he turned his laser focus back to Maya. He looked at her hands. They were rough, red, and chapped from hours of scrubbing dishes and carrying hot trays. "You have the hands of a laborer," Sterling observed quietly. "But you play like a dream." He reached into his jacket pocket. Maya flinched again, terrified he was pulling out a phone to call the police or security. But instead, he pulled out a handkerchief. He didn't offer it to her, he just held it in his hand, twisting the fabric nervously. "I was a violinist once," Sterling said suddenly. The statement was so unexpected that Maya blinked in surprise. "You?" "A long time ago," Sterling said, his eyes losing focus, drifting to the ceiling. "Before the money. Before the buildings. I wanted to play. But I didn't have the fire. I had the technique, but not the soul. My teacher told me I played like a computer. He was right. So, I quit." He looked down at the piano keys again, then at Maya. "What you just played, that wasn't notes on a page. That was grief and love and anger all fighting each other. I haven't heard anything like that since I was a boy." The room felt incredibly intimate. It was strange to hear this powerful, intimidating man talking about his failures and his dreams to a waitress he didn't know an hour ago. The walls of the restaurant seemed to fade away. Maya didn't know what to say. She felt a sudden wave of pity for him. He had everything money could buy: the fancy suit, the expensive dinners, the power, but he had lost his music. She had nothing, but she still had the song in her heart. "Why are you doing this?" Sterling asked, his voice dropping to a whisper that only she could hear. "Why are you here, carrying plates, when your hands were made for this?" The question hung in the air between them. It was the question Maya had been asking herself every night for 2 years. It was the question that kept her awake when her rent was due. It was the reason she hadn't touched a piano since her grandmother's funeral. "Because music doesn't pay the bills," Maya said softly, her voice gaining strength. "Because I have to eat. Because I have responsibilities." Sterling looked at her, really looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time. He wasn't looking at a waitress anymore. He was looking at a survivor. He saw the stubbornness in her jaw and the pride in her eyes. He realized that the music she played was powerful because she had lived through hard times. She hadn't been locked away in some fancy school. She had lived in the real world, and that pain had made her art beautiful. And now Sterling asked, "What happens now?" The spell was breaking. The reality of the situation was crashing back in. Maya realized she was still on the clock. She was still holding up the service. "Now, I get back to work," Maya said, though her voice broke slightly. "If I still have a job." She turned to look at Tom, the manager. Tom was shaking his head frantically, waving his hands as if to say, "Are you crazy? Of course you have a job." Sterling followed her gaze. He saw the manager's reaction. He let out a short breath. He reached out and, for the first time, touched her shoulder. It was a gentle touch, almost fatherly. "Work," Sterling said, the word tasting strange in his mouth. Yes. Of course. We all have our roles to play, don't we? He stepped back, putting the polite distance between them again. He buttoned his jacket, composing himself. The millionaire mask slipped back into place, but it was different now. The cracks were visible. The coldness was gone. I'm not leaving yet, Sterling said firmly, looking at her. And I am not drinking this wine in silence. Play something else. It wasn't a request. It was a command. But it wasn't the command of a boss to an employee. It was the command of a fan to an artist. He was begging her, in his own stubborn way, to stay in that world where only the music mattered. Maya looked at the bench. She looked at her hands, which had stopped shaking. She looked at the room full of people who were waiting, breath held, desperate for her to say yes. She didn't sit down immediately. She just stood there, balancing on the edge of a knife. One more song could cost her her job, or it could change her life forever. She looked at Sterling, and for a second, she saw not a millionaire, but a lonely man who just wanted to hear something real. One more, Maya whispered. And as she sat back down on the bench, the room seemed to exhale a collective sigh of relief. The night wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. When Maya sat back down on the bench, the air in the room shifted. The first time she had sat there, it was an act of desperation, a split-second decision born out of panic. This time, it was a choice. She felt different. The fear was still there, hiding in the corners of her mind, but it was pushed aside by a strange, calm sense of purpose. She looked at the keys, and for the first time in 2 years, she didn't see a reminder of what she had lost. She saw a tool she could use. She didn't start with a bang this time. She didn't need to prove anything anymore. She placed her hands gently on the keys and began to play a soft, simple melody. It was a lullaby, something sweet and gentle that felt like a warm breeze after a storm. The notes trickled out like water, flowing over the jagged edges of the tension in the room. The change in the atmosphere was instant. The customers stopped holding their breaths. The waiters, who had been frozen like statues, began to move again, but they moved quietly, respecting the music. The clinking of glasses returned, but it was softer now, a rhythmic accompaniment to the piano rather than a distraction. Mr. Sterling stood exactly where he was, his arms still crossed, but the harsh lines of his face had softened. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the music wash over him. He wasn't analyzing the technique or judging the performance. He was just feeling it. The music was telling a story about hope, about the morning sun coming out after a long, dark night. It was a story he needed to hear. Maya let herself get lost in the flow. She wasn't thinking about the rent or the cold apartment waiting for her. She wasn't thinking about the blisters on her feet or the ache in her back. She was thinking about the beauty of the sound. She remembered why she fell in love with the piano in the first place. It was the only place where she felt completely free, where she could say things she could never speak out loud. As the song progressed, the melody became more complex, weaving layers of sound together. It was happy, but there was a touch of sadness to it, the kind of sadness you feel when you remember a happy memory. The customers were enchanted. People stopped eating entirely. A few of them had tears in their eyes, wiped away quickly with napkins. The music had connected them all. In that moment, the rich businessman and the busboys were feeling the exact same thing. When Maya played the final note, she let it ring out until it faded into nothingness. She sat there for a moment, her hands resting on her lap, listening to the silence return. But this silence wasn't heavy. It was peaceful. It was the satisfied silence of a story well told. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then, a man at the bar started clapping. Slowly at first, just a slap of the palm against the wood. Then, the applause spread. It wasn't the polite, bored clapping you usually hear in a restaurant. It was genuine. It was loud. It filled the room with a warmth that chased away the chill. The patrons stood up, turning toward the stage. Even the other waitresses were clapping, cheering for their friend. Maya turned around on the bench, her face flushed red. She looked terrified and thrilled at the same time. She searched the crowd and found Tom near the bar. He was wiping his eyes with the back of his hand, giving her a thumbs up. Then, she looked for Mr. Sterling. He hadn't clapped. He was just standing there, looking at her. As the applause died down, he walked toward the stage again. The crowd parted for him like the sea. He stepped up, his hands in his pockets, looking more casual than he had all night. "You play better when you aren't angry," Sterling said. His voice was dry, but there was a twinkle in his eye that hadn't been there before. Maya let out a small, nervous laugh. "I guess I do. Thank you for listening." "Don't thank me," Sterling waved his hand dismissively. "I was the one storming out like a child. You saved the evening. You saved Tom from having a heart attack, and you saved me from a very boring meeting." He looked around the room, then leaned in closer to her. The noise of the restaurant was picking up again, people buzzing with excitement, but in their little bubble, it was quiet. "Why did you stop?" Sterling asked the question that had been bothering him. "I heard your education. You didn't learn to play like that in a garage. You had training. You could be touring the world. Why are you here?" Maya looked down at her shoes. The old shame came creeping back. "Life happened," she said softly. "My grandmother got sick. The bills piled up. Playing doesn't pay for medicine. Playing doesn't pay the rent. I had to make a choice. I chose to survive." Sterling nodded slowly. He didn't look down on her. If anything, he looked impressed. "Survival," he repeated. "It is a powerful motivator. But it is a terrible waste of talent. The world is full of people trying to survive. It is very short on people who can make the soul sing." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a leather checkbook. Maya flinched, thinking he was leaving a tip on the piano bench. He uncapped a fountain pen with a sharp click. "Mr. Sterling, please, you don't have to." "Be quiet," Sterling said, not looking up. He scribbled something on the check with fast, aggressive strokes. He tore it out and held it out to her. Maya looked at the piece of paper. It wasn't a tip. The number on it had more zeros than she had ever seen in her life. It was enough to pay off her debts. It was enough to pay for a year of rent. It was enough to buy her time. "This is too much," she gasped, shaking her head. "I can't take this. I just played a couple of songs." "It is not a payment for the songs," Sterling said, his voice hardening. "I don't pay for music. I invest in it. Consider this a grant. A scholarship. Use it to quit this job. Use it to fix whatever problems you have. And use it to buy yourself a piano so you don't have to sneak around at night." He shoved the check toward her chest. "Take it." Maya's hands trembled as she took the paper. It felt heavy, like it weighed 100 pounds. She looked at the signature. It was real. But why, she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. You don't even know me. I know enough, Sterling said, buttoning his coat. I know that tonight, I came here feeling like the king of the world, and I left feeling like a student. That is worth more to me than this check. He gestured vaguely at the paper. Besides, I hate waste. And letting you rot in this restaurant when you could be creating masterpieces, that is the biggest waste of all. He turned to walk away, but he stopped after 2 steps. He looked back over his shoulder. There is a theater downtown. The old Sterling Hall. I own it. It sits empty most nights. Find me when you are ready. We will find you an audience. He didn't wait for a thank you. He didn't want one. He simply turned and walked toward the door, his 2 associates scrambling to grab their coats and follow him. The patrons watched him go with a mix of shock and admiration. Tom rushed over to the stage, his face a mixture of excitement and confusion. Maya, what did he say? Did he complain? Was he angry? Maya looked at the check in her hand. Then she looked at the piano. Then she looked at her best friend, the manager. No, Tom, Maya said, a smile spreading across her face that reached all the way to her eyes. It was a genuine smile, the kind she hadn't worn in a long time. He wasn't angry. He just gave me my life back. She stood up and slipped the check carefully into her pocket. She patted the top of the piano one last time, a gentle goodbye. The applause had died down, and the restaurant was returning to normal, but for Maya, nothing would ever be normal again. She walked away from the stage, leaving the empty bench behind. She didn't need to hide anymore. She didn't need to be invisible. As she walked through the tables toward the kitchen to hang up her apron, the air felt lighter. The rain was still beating against the windows, but it didn't sound cold anymore. It sounded like applause. She knew she would have to work hard. She knew she would have to practice until her fingers bled to get back to where she used to be. But for the first time in 2 years, the path was clear. The music was back. And this time, she wasn't going to let it go.